Hello, everyone, and welcome to Thursdays at the Museum with the Detroit Institute of Arts. I'm Amanda Harrison, a Engagement Manager with the DIA. The DIA would like to thank the residents of Macomb, Oakland, and Wayne counties for their generous millage support, which provides free admission to Tri County residents, free school field trips, and specialty programming for adults 55 and older. Today, we're going to learn more about decorative arts in the DIA's collection with trained docents Cindy Patrick and Ray Henney. During the program, as always, I'd like to encourage you to please ask questions. You can do this by logging into YouTube using your Gmail account or by leaving a public comment on this Facebook post. Questions will be read on screen by Christine Mark, the DIA's Manager of Volunteer Development. Now, please welcome Cindy Patrick and Ray Henney. Hey,
Thanks,
everybody.
Amanda. Hi,
Hello,
Cindy. How
everyone.
you doing today? Well, as Amanda mentioned, this is part two of a virtual tour that we call What's for Dinner, the DIA's outstanding collection of decorative arts. And there's two reasons why we're presenting a part two. The first is it turned out that part one was a popular segment, and there was request for a part two. But second, and most importantly, Cindy wanted to give her husband's ideas for her birthday and holiday gifts. So we're now doing part two. So today's virtual tour is not really about art objects. None of the items that we will be exploring today were meant to be in a museum or on display. They were all meant to have a function and to be used. Specifically, they are all receptacles or containers for meals. Yet each is skillfully made and beautifully designed, so much so that they are part of the DIA's collection. Next slide, please. Thank you, Kathleen. So this ceramic jar was made 8,000 years ago, likely by a homemaker to store and serve food for her family. Yet the maker took considerable time and effort to paint the symmetrical design on the surface of the jar. So what does it say about the human spirit? That there's this need to create to make a perfectly functional object more beautiful and meaningful. So Cindy, should we start?
I'm ready to go, Ray.
All right, let's go to our first piece. Thank you. Initially trained in Rome by the best Roman silversmiths, the artist or craftsman for this work is the famous Thomas Germain, who was the preeminent Parisian silversmith of the Rococo period. Now, Rococo was a French movement of an exceptionally ornamental style of art and decoration. His work exemplifies the earliest and most imaginative phase of that style. Germain was considered to be the best silversmith of his generation, and he was honored by being the silversmith for King Louis XV, and he was afforded housing at the Louvre. So famous was Germain's artistry that the legendary philosopher Voltaire immortalized Germain's, quote, divine hand, end of quote, in a poem. It's high praise. This terrine, with lid and stand, created in 1729 through 30, was given to the DIA by Elizabeth Firestone, along with many other exquisite silver pieces. It is on display on the third floor in the DIA's Splendid Living Gallery. And boy, was there splendid living. During the 18th century, terrines ceased to be merely utilitarian vessels, for the service of soup and stews and sauces, and they became masterpieces of sculpture, due in part to the demand of the nobility and the wealthy class for dinnerware demonstrating their wealth and their status. Part of a set of 4 terrines executed by Germain, this is the first known example in Parisian silver of a terrine decorated with this naturalistically modeled still life on the lid. Now the terrine is about 8.5 inches high, 17 inches wide, and almost 14 inches deep. It was meant to be used for the soup or stew course, and it was surrounded by dishes and platters, such as fish and salads and so forth. The terrine is heavy. It was made by pouring the finest silver available, the finest molten silver available into the molds, then hammered, chiseled, and pierced. Germain excelled at the silversmith technique called chasing, in which minute details and refinements were added to the silver surface. Cindy, you can really see that chasing technique captures the three-dimensional realism that was so valued at the time. During the 18th century, terrines with this high degree of realism were in great demand as lifelike renderings were cherished for their technical excellence and valued really as a status symbol. And Germain certainly did deliver that. This work demonstrates a perfection of execution and an incredibly subtle balance between complexity and restraint. It was praised by experts at the time as being, quote, perhaps the most beautiful example of French silver in existence, end of quote. Next slide, please. The high degree of technical sophistication is evident in the three-dimensional elements of the terrine. To the left is one of the wonderfully formed handles, and to the right is the exquisitely executed lid. Now let's take a look at the lid. Next slide, please. For the objects on the lid, Germain first made molds of actual vegetables and dead animals and fish. Then he cast them in silver, added further embellishments, soldered and screwed the various pieces into the desired arrangement, and then polished the finished piece to create this seamless arrangement. As was the custom, the objects on the lid reflect what typically was served in the terrine. Consistent with a status symbol, however, the lid displayed exotic and rare foods. Pile high on the lid is an ortolan, which is that small bird that you see at the top of the slide. You're right. It's a European songbird and game bird. There's also asparagus, peas, morels, hake, oysters, and other gastronomic delicacies intended to denote the terrine's contents and the high status of the owner. Next slide, please. So the ortolan is the rare aromatic bird that appears so realistic on the lid that you can almost imagine touching it. I mean, it is the slide robs us of the incredible three-dimension and realistic nature of this particular item. Now, it's an exotic bird, and you can see one of them on the top right. There is a picture of one of these birds, and it was considered in the day and still today to be a great delicacy. The custom in the 18th century, as it is now, was to eat the whole bird while holding a napkin over one's head to take in the aroma. And you can see people doing that on the bottom right. Now, Cindy, when your husband buys you this terrine, you're going to have to make the Orland dish, for your family. And can you imagine your family at the dinner table with their like this, and they take the way you eat this thing is you take the whole bird by the head and you stuff it in your mouth and you chew it until there's just bones left, and then you spit out the bones. I really think, Cindy, that the reason you're hiding your face is because, you don't want to be there with everybody spitting out their bones. You know what I mean? That's just so unsightly. Anyway, something to think about, Cindy, and I'm happy to come over for dinner and wear a napkin on my head.
Ray, not only did I love your description of the artisan's process, I love the dramatization of the meal.
Thank you, Cindy. So let's go back to the work. Next slide, please. While this piece was meant to be used, It really is an extraordinary work of art, and it is very fortunate that it is in the DIA's collection. Christine, are there any questions?
Not at this time, Ray, but
Right.
I can just imagine you having that at family dinner.
I know. Well, let's go on to the next piece. This wonderfully intricate dining table centerpiece is known by the French term éperon. Éperons appeared in France and England after the 1700s, really 1700s. While they certainly enriched the beauty and elegance of the dining table, their practical purpose was convenience. It places the food within reach of all the diners to avoid having to pass the dishes. Made from high quality silver, the DIA's piece is 14.5 inches tall, about 28 inches wide, and 26 inches deep. It is typically used for serving sweetmeats, fruits, and desserts. This sophisticated, wonderfully executed design and craftsmanship is by the English-born William Cripps, who lived from 1717 through 1767. Cripps founded and ran a prominent and prolific manufacturing and retail silversmith shop based in London. Cripps specialized in fine tableware pieces and is considered by scholars as one of the masters of the ornamental Rococo style. Cripps silver pieces are sought by collectors and museums around the world. It's indeed fortunate that we have such a wonderful specimen in the DIA's collection. Now, next slide, please. So the DIA's Cripps éperon is displayed on the third floor in the splendid living gallery beside what you see in the center there, which is the virtual dining table. The arrow is pointed to the éperon. You can see it on the left in its display case. Installed in early 2008, this unique interactive table projects a video showing how various DIA pieces, including the éperon, would be used in the elaborate dining practices of the nobility and the wealthy of the 18th century. And the table is really popular with families and children as it brings to life the DIA's collection of dinnerware that surround you as you sit there in the gallery. Next slide, please. This photo shows the éperon in its display case and in the virtual dining table's video. So you can see it in the video there holding various fruits. It is in the center of the table and it's being used, this is for the midday meal. And yes, viewers, that is our own Cindy Patrick there in the bottom left corner, seated there. Yes, our own Miss Splendid Living participated in some promotional photos. Next slide, please. Now you can see in the background by the, over the table is this painting, exactly, Kathleen. And it's painted by the French artist Detroit and hangs, right, and it's currently on display right in that exact location. Now, in the 18th century, particularly in France, meals became a form of entertainment and socialization. They often were hours long and accompanied by music and other performances. Here, the artist depicts the wealthy at lunch, drinking wine in costumes. It certainly demonstrates that the leisure life that the upper class had in the 18th century. So, Cindy, I'm thinking that you can make that Ortland dish at lunch and we can all wear costumes too. What do you think?
I just want to know if you're supposed to eat the bird with all the feathers still on it.
No, they do take the feathers off. In fact, I didn't want to go into this, but there's like recipes because they still currently do that. They eat that in France, and there's various recipes. And for my little bit of research into it, they always take the feathers off. So can you imagine what that looks like? Anyway, not very appetizing. Next slide, please. So here is a photo of the terrine in the video demonstrating its use for, now this is the evening meal. Before it was the midday meal. And the video shows the serving pieces full of food and dishes that were customary in the 18th century, and the diners helping themselves. The video has sound, and one can hear the diners interacting. Now, those arms and hands are of former DIA employees who traveled to New York City along with the DIA pieces that are shown in the video to participate in the filming of the video. And they didn't really wear costumes. They wore sleeves that were in the fashion of the 18th century wealthy class. And they also wore powdered wigs because from time to time the top of their heads show up in the video. Let's take a next slide, please. So let's take one more look at this delightfully intricate work. Notice the artistry in the elaborate base, arms, dishes, and the finely netted bowl, which seems to hover weightlessly in the center. Christine, before we go to the next piece, are there any questions?
Oh, you had a comment about how the ortolan dinner sounds especially awful, especially for the bird.
I know. And it's supposed to be a lovely singing bird too. So I guess we won't say that it's swan song, but it's very interesting. Yes.
Well, I know that our curator, Dr. Alan Darr, says that the ortolan is supposed to be especially fragrant and have just a wonderful aroma.
Aroma, yes.
And that's part of the reason that they put the napkin
That's
over
why
there.
they put the leg. That's their
Despite
excuse.
your joking that it was so people couldn't see you spitting.
I know. No, I know. And I did mention that before, wondering about the real practical use of the napkin.
Yeah. Not for me, thank you.
Okay. You could come still to Cindy's for lunch because everyone wears costumes. So,
Ray, I just wanted to mention as we're looking at this last slide, and the apparent one more time, I think it's amazing this thing has survived since the 1700s. It's so delicate, and as you said, it's so like airy and fine. It's amazing that it's all in one piece.
And especially it didn't get melted down after the French Revolution.
That's a good point.
Something to be said for that.
Right.
But you know that you can't see a blemish. If there's any blemishes on that, it's undetectable to the naked eye. And the basket in the center, that intricate basket, it's remarkable that there isn't a chip, a nick, or a missing piece to it. So it's in wonderful shape. All right, let's go to the next piece. There you go, Cindy. Now we're getting to your favorite part. Items used for drinking wine. So this pair of wine bottle coolers were designed and crafted by Jean-Baptiste Claude Odio, a member of a prominent family of French silversmiths, active from the early 18th century. Odio became one of the most important precious metal workers and designers in Paris. In the late 18th century and early 19th centuries, he was the man, if you will, of silversmiths. He owned a prominent and highly successful workshop, and he was the favorite of King Louis XVI, then Napoleon, and then King Louis XVII. Indeed, Odio's workshop was the most important silversmith factory in Paris in the first half of the 19th century. His patrons included the King of Bavaria, the Empress of Austria, the courts of both Poland and Naples, and other distinguished French and foreign clientele. Now, he retired in 1827, leaving his precious and prestigious firm to his son Charles, who also worked in the Rococo Revival style. Now, each of these silver-gilded coolers is approximately 14.5 inches tall and 10 inches wide and about 8 inches deep. In the 18th century, silver gild was the process of heating silver until it turned it into a gold color. These pieces were designed for a banquet table and were originally part of a 119-piece dinner set delivered by the Odio firm to a Russian prince who was living in Paris in 1817 and 1818. The shape of the coolers matched the wine bottles of the day. The bottles then were squattier and smaller than modern day wine bottles. Next slide, please. The form of these wine coolers is borrowed from the classic ancient crater, which is pictured on the right there. It is a two-handed vessel used to mix water and wine in ancient Greece and Rome. And Cindy will be presenting this and other such vessels in just a moment, because Cindy knows all about wine and drinking wine. So you'll notice, though, in the Greek vessel that there's these various images. Next slide, please, Kathleen. Odio's cooler has a Cupid figure on the left, with the flute, and a centaur with the harp, which is a half man and a half horse. In mythology, the god of wine, Bacchus or Dionysus, tames the centaur in front of Cupid. Throughout the history of art, Cupid and centaur are shown as frequent companions to Dionysus or Bacchus. So what a perfect image to place on a wine cooler. Next slide, please. One final note here. The current handles, those women on the side, those are actually the handles for the cooler. They are applied cast figures which were added later to replace the originals that apparently were showing wear and tear. Next slide, please. So the coolers are displayed in a third-floor gallery next to the portrait of Odio, painted by Robert Lefebvre. The coolers are on the left, and the dishes created by Odio are on the right. Lefebvre became a prominent portrait painter during Napoleon's time and became Napoleon's official painter. He painted various portraits of Napoleon and his family. Later, he was appointed royal painter to King Louis XVII, and painted portraits of the king and his royal family. Next slide, please. So this painting is large. It's 6 feet tall and 5 feet wide, and it's displayed in its original frame. That's the first and only frame that the painting has ever had. The portrait communicates Odio's professional success and stature. You see him seated in front of a drawing table with his, drawings for Napoleon and Napoleon's mother on his lap. On the table are massive pieces of gold and silver works that Odio designed and crafted. And Cindy, I understand that 2 of those mass pieces are based upon ancient Greek vessels. You want to comment on that?
Sure, Ray. So the taller of the two, that's gold in color, is based on the shape of an amphora, which was a storage vessel. And then at the top, there are like 2 little circles at the top of the handles. Those are called volutes. And amphoras, not only were they used for storage, but sometimes they would be used as grave markers or dedicated to a person, dedicated to the person who was in the grave. And then next to that, the flatter one, that's silver, the shape of that's called a kylix, and those were used for drinking. That's a pretty big drinking cup, about the right size for your house, I'd say.
It's interesting how the wine coolers are based upon an ancient Greek vessel, the crater, and that they're shown. Obviously, that was an extremely popular design at the time. This classical design was considered highly desirable. Cindy, Odio truly had a powerful legacy, and really the DIA is fortunate to have his works on display. Christine, do we have any questions before I turn it over to Cindy?
No, we don't. We looked. Did we look at a minute too at the wine coolers on the left, and then the other pieces on the right?
Right. You want to go back a slide or
Yeah,
two? Yeah. Right there.
yeah. So those little dishes, we don't have a close up of those, but what would have been served under that little lid?
Those were like terrines, smaller versions of terrines that were, if I have this right, I may be thinking of something else. I thought those were for individual settings.
Oh, so the wait staff would put it down in front of a.
Yeah, and then they'd go like this.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So they're either terrines or
Reveal.
plates. They could be plates, Christine, but you know
Okay.
that they do the they do the whole showmanship for. But
Hmm.
they were for individual serving.
Okay. The big reveal, right?
Yeah, Cindy, at lunch with her wine and her costumes has the big reveal.
I should have worn one of those big white wigs today.
Cindy, you could pick the lid off and say, voila.
Voila.
Thanks so much.
I don't know about everybody else, but I'm having a blast.
You're a good sport. All right, Cindy, here we go.
Well, I got to tell you, Ray, this thing is just about as odd as that story of serving the ortolan and how you breathe in the aroma and spit out the bones. I mean, the title here kind of gives us an idea that it's a double cup. But when you look at it without the title, you would wonder, it almost looks like it could be something that would be used in a religious ceremony. Since Ray's already discussed gilt, we don't have to go over that again. So this is silver with gilt over the top of it. So Hans Petzold, who was from Nuremberg, which was sort of the center for metalsmithing and gilding, it was known to be an area of the world where the most beautiful and spectacular things were being made. So this double cup, if we can go to the next slide, is actually two. And this, when the two are together, it's about 22 inches tall. So when they're separated, I'd say they're probably about, 9.5, maybe 10 inches in height, because one has to fit over the top of the other one. And these reside in our Northern Renaissance galleries, and they are installed right next to the doorway that goes into our Baroque gallery. So if any of you are going to the museum, that's where you can find it. So why was this created? It actually wasn't used for a religious rite. It was commissioned for a family, and it was meant not to be used. It was totally for display purposes only. So it's kind of Gothic in style with this Northern Renaissance kind of idea mixed in, and we'll get to what elements actually lean toward that. So one is inverted over the other so that each can function alternately as either a base or a bowl. And they were created to mark important events such as wedding or dignitary's visit. This isn't the only one that exists. There are others in other museums. So at the time, while I don't want to say there were many of them made, it was a popular commission among the folks who could afford such an item. So the double cup, as I said, was made by Hans Petzold. He was the preeminent goldsmith in Nuremberg. And the Renaissance splendor part of it comes from, and Kathleen, if you'll get out your trusty cursor, underneath the cup that's on the left, if you look toward the stem, it's a little bit difficult to tell in this slide, but those are actually caryatids, which are forms of women standing that hold up the cup. And then as I was doing a little bit of further research, I found that the filigree part, which would be at the top of the caryatids, Kathleen, if you can point out right there, those are removable pieces. And I think I read that there's like, let's see, they're called jewel-like ornaments, and there are 9 of them that can be removed. And then up at the top around the band or the rim, Ray was talking.
Before you go on, I just have a question.
Yes.
Are those hung like this is a bad analogy, like earrings, like, decorative.
I don't think that they're hung on a loop. I think they actually have like a little clip that sort of
Well, that
clips
would make
in.
sense because if you put it upside down,
Yep, yep.
yeah, okay, that
So
would make sense.
they're not suspended. They're clipped in.
Okay, they're beautiful.
So yeah, and along the rim, Ray had already talked about the method of chasing, and that's what the artist used there. And at first, when we were looking at this, we were describing them as foliate, scroll work, or grotesques. In further research, we can't see it here, but I found that those are actually floral motifs and insects along the rim. What the purpose of that is, I'm not sure. On the interior of the cup that's on the right, there's a medallion at the bottom. And each of these had a silver medallion. And one was the portrait of the husband, and one was a portrait of the wife, the folks who commissioned this. So let me give you their names. His name was Jacob Stark, and he was a senior Burgermeister in Nuremberg. And a Burgermeister was an official, of the city. And his wife's name was Elizabeth, and her maiden name was Ursula von Goslar. And the only reason that's important, we'll see in just a minute. So I don't know if we can go to the next slide. I don't think we ever can see the bottom. No, let's go back again, Kathleen. So if we were able to flip these over and look at the underside of the base, on the underside, under his portrait, is another silver medallion. And on that medallion is his family's coat of arms. So the Stark coat of arms. And then around that coat of arms is an inscription in Latin. And it says, "In timor Domini fortitudo nostra." And it means the fear of the Lord is our strength. On the bottom of her goblet with her portrait is her family coat of arms. And inscribed around it in Latin is "Gut elien dier," which means go alone the glory. So, I mean, there is sort of, what could I say? Sort of like a moral warning on these goblets to, be faithful, be devout. If we go to the next, so as I said, they're about 22 inches tall, and side by side, it's difficult to see that one is larger than the other because they were made so closely in size that when the one is inverted over the other one, it just fits together perfectly. And as you can imagine, with all of those beautiful little pieces, the 9 pieces that can be detached, it would be very difficult to hold your hand around this stem and actually drink from this. So truly, they were only meant to serve as sort of a dedication or as a symbol of these two ruling families who were both very important families in Nuremberg at the time. Christine, do we have any questions about the lovely gold goblets?
We actually don't, Cindy, but
Okay.
you said they're located on the first floor in the Northern Renaissance Gallery.
It would
They're
be
right
second
next-
floor. Second
That's
floor.
second floor, yes.
Yep.
And they're right next to our very famous Bruegel painting.
The wedding, yep, the wedding dance. So they're in between the wedding dance and the doorway into Baroque.
Okay, and there was a quick question here in regard to the provenance, and these pieces do have a very interesting provenance, and for the sake of our short time, I don't think we can go into the whole thing, but Cindy, do you want to speak just really super briefly on that?
These were among some of the works of art that were taken during the Nazi regime. And I believe it was only in 2002 that they were repatriated. And, they were found and repatriated and then sold at auction. So they do. If someone would like to, go onto our website and take a look, you can get, more of the story there. But yeah, so, I mean, those kinds of items come up frequently. We read about them in the newspaper. And so these do have a provenance. It's a little more dramatic than most.
That's right. And the company or the families choose whether to keep them or whether to sell them. and then they are awarded the proceeds, or they are awarded the art piece. And in this case, they took the money.
Right.
Right.
If the viewer is interested, Simon Goodman wrote a book which includes this piece, the story of this piece in it. It's called The Orpheus Clock.
That's right. Oh, it's right
Orpheus
here.
clock.
Yeah, so if you're interested in it, it does talk about the DIA's double cup. It's an interesting story. It's kind of like a mystery story, because the gentleman who found out about the art being confiscated didn't even know he was Jewish, let alone he had a family who had such a fabulous collection. Anyway, go ahead, Cindy.
Thanks for that extra added info, Ray. I'll have to grab that book. I'd like to read it. Okay, moving on to our next. We're going to descend into the world of Greek wine vessels. So in the DIA, on the second
Look
floor.
how she lit up. Now we're talking about mixing wine.
Right. Surrounding the atrium of Prentice Court, we have an interpretive installed, and it's actually a video of silhouettes. And the silhouettes are shown using these vessels. And it's interesting to look at, because I think a picture's worth 1,000 words. I can sit here and tell you what the names of them are, and we can look at them, but to actually see them in use, I think really imprints it into your mind, what they were created for. And when Ray was talking earlier about the wine coolers from Odio, part of the reason that some of these ancient forms were continued and in use was because of the illiteracy of people. I mean, they could look at a shape of something that came, from years and years ago and had been used for years and years, and they would know what it was for. They didn't have to read about it. No one had to tell them about it. They could tell by the shape of it, this is what we use it for. So, they were created with utilitarian purpose in mind, but they also served the purpose that people they would be easily identifiable to people. And let's face it, most of the folks who were serving wine were probably enslaved, and would have definitely been illiterate. So here we see mixing wine. Every shape has a purpose. So everyone drank wine in the ancient world, men, women, and children, free and slave alike. Potters shaped clay into these full-bodied vessels and specifically made them to store, mix, or serve this essential beverage. So the first one you can see is a wide-mouthed bowl, and it was used to mix wine with water. Then the second image is of an amphora. This is a two-handled storage jar, in which they held wine for the time that was needed for it to ferment. And my understanding is that back in Grecian times, these beverages were fermented to a very high alcohol content and a very high sugar content. So they definitely had to be mixed with water to be palatable. The third one is called a hydria, and it's a water container. And all of these, with the exception of the one at the top, the other two would have had lids. And some are still extant with their lids. Very rare. The lids, for the most part, have been lost, over time, but they were meant to have lids. So then we go to serving wine at the banquet. And during the banquet in Rome, women were allowed to attend the banquet, but in Greece, banquets were only for men. Women would have only been in attendance to serve the men. So this first little piece, the silhouette, is something called, I hope I can say it, an anakoui. And thank goodness when we have our rehearsals, all of us get together and we work together and we work on these pronunciations and we work on, additional questions and research. So I have to thank Kathleen McBroom, who's doing the slides today, for helping me with the pronunciation. So that was a small picture, and we'll see in a moment. It was anthropomorphic usually, so it had a face of a person or an animal. It was made in the shape of the face of a person or an animal. The second one below that is a kylix, and this was the cup that was used for drinking, but it wasn't small. It was pretty large, probably anywhere from 7 to 10 inches across. And then the bottom one is actually an oil lamp, which doesn't have anything to do with drinking. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So we'll start with the storage jar or amphora. Boy, we've got a lot of information about this guy. So in the storage jar, this is where the wine would be, held to be fermented. And the idea here was once it was ready to be used, and we would have to go into this mixing convention. So the recipe that we have been trained to understand is that a mixture of, we'll say, 1 cup of wine to 3 cups of water would have yielded wine that was good for conversational purposes. 1 cup of wine to 2 cups of water would have yielded a liquid that would have been used when fun was to be had. And then a liquid ratio of 1 cup of wine to 1 cup of water would have been used for orgiastic revelry. Ray.
Oh.
So as we were going along and we were taking a look at these vessels, during our rehearsal, we were looking at, the images that were on them, the imagery, and we started to wonder, what exactly is the imagery? So I think we'll move ahead one because I think we have a comparison there. So I want to talk a little bit about how they were made before I go into the imagery. So they were made in sections, and you can see the top is called the mouth. The part right underneath that, Kathleen, if you can get out your trusty cursor, where it kind of comes in, is called the neck. The wider part is called the body, and the bottom is called the foot. And of course, we have the handles. So with the amphora, we have something called the Panathenaic amphora, which was an amazing. Of which these two are both Panathenaic amphoras. So the one that's on the left is in the DIA's collection, and these were given as awards during the Panathenaic Games, which occurred every 4 years. And they went through the, I want to say, the 5th, 4th, 3rd, and 2nd centuries, so for hundreds of years. And the front of this, which we don't see, has Athena, the goddess of war, on it. And then on the back, we can see these fellas having a foot race. So for this particular athletic contest, the winner of the foot race would have been awarded, I believe, 60 of these amphoras filled with a very special olive oil that came from a very special olive grove. So it had a lot of value. I mean, in terms of what was inside of this amphora, it had value. And over the course of a series of games, up to 1,450 of these amphoras would be awarded. So imagine we didn't just have one artist or one workshop working on these amphoras. There were many, many, many people who were working on these amphoras. And sorry, Siri's talking back to me. So on the bottom, you can see this is attributed to the Asteos group. The one prior to this and the one that we see on the right is called the swing painter. The naming convention on these was really unusual. Sometimes the name might come from the location where it was found. The name of the artist might be associated with the museum that it now resides in. The name could be associated with a necropolis where it was dug up. So the naming conventions are kind of crazy. And the one on the right is called the swing painter. Why was he known as a swing painter? Well, when they, unearthed these and they had enough of them that they could do comparisons and they could say, this, maybe this 5 or 10, they all look like they were done by the same artist. One of those had an image of a swing on it. And so he became the swing painter. We'll see another one that comes up shortly, the pig painter. So there was an image on one of his that was of a shepherd herding pigs. So the naming conventions were, really very unusual. So on the front of this one, and Kathleen, I'm really going to need your help here. We're going to just talk about the two central figures. So the one who is on the right, who is kneeling, he has his head facing in the opposite direction from the way he's kneeling. He has on a Corinthian helmet with a feathered headdress. He's holding a shield in one hand. And the man on the left who is standing, he's holding a spear. He has on what's called a cuirass, which is a breastplate. And then across his arm, he has another shield. And you can see it's got 2 white dots on it. This tells us that these were hoplites. Well, what's a hoplite? A hoplite was we'll call it a regiment of soldiers made up of artisans and farmers. They were people who weren't really militarily trained, but they were almost like it would be like a volunteer army today. So when there was a battle, they were expected to volunteer and help. And they were known to, in their regiment, they would create what we call the phalanx, which is, if you've ever seen in Greek or Roman movies that are about battle, where they put their shields up together one by one and they create like a wall to go across. So that was the method that they used when they fought in battle. Let's see. Okay, if we can move ahead one, please. So now we are moving to the pig painter. And this is a water jar, or what's known as a hydria. And there's a lot of information about this one. Ray, I don't know if you're ready for this. This imagery is pretty unusual. Might be more unusual than the ortolan. So across the shoulders of this, you can see that there are several figures. And when we did our research on this, we found that this is actually an image of a fountain house, which was a place with an unsavory reputation. And depicted on the front, on the left is a man, and he is handing something to the woman on the right. And what he's handing her is a coin. And the coin represents, in Greek art, it represents the idea of a woman being paid for prostitution. So we know that prostitution was accepted, and it was a legal practice at the time. So this is a fountain house where men would go and have, unsavory activity. Our Detroit piece is especially rare because it only shows that single coin being handed to the woman. In most of the other hydrias or other vessels that would show a fountain house, they're handing a whole purse full of coins. So the question here is the woman on the right, I don't think she's happy with just accepting that one coin. And I think she's probably getting ready to turn her back on him, which could be, if we look at the woman is directly to her right, could be her turning and walking away from him. Maybe.
So this is sort of negotiation style.
It was a negotiation, and I don't think he came out well at the end of that negotiation. I think he ended up by himself. Okay, Kathleen, if you'll move to the next. And I should add, most of these are around 12 to maybe 14 or 15 inches high. So, they're not small. They're pretty big. And the fact that they were used during, revelry or during drinking, it's amazing that they do still exist in one piece. So this was the piece that Ray was comparing to the Odio wine coolers. So this is a mixing vessel or a crater, and this is where they would mix the water in the wine. And you can see that it's got a really wide mouth. It's got the two handles underneath, and they were applied in such a way that they were very strong, because when this was full, it would have been pretty heavy. You can see it says Larghetto painter. So the Larghetto painter is named after an actual necropolis that was near the city of, I think it's called Paestum, which was in Italy. But remember, during this time, borders changed. So it was probably occupied by the Greeks at the time that this was created. So these workshops endured. They were all over, the area. Everyone was making terracotta. But if you notice, this one's a little bit lighter than the other ones we looked at. And this is one of the attributes that point to Larghetto, because the clay from Larghetto was very light. It was so light, it was almost blonde. And so they would actually put terracotta washes over it to try and get that more desired red effect. So what are these folks doing on the front of here? Well, I have to give a shout out to the director of our research library and archives, because we were able to find the information on all of these except this one. This was the mystery. So sent a little note out to her, and I said, we've really worked hard. We've tried to find. Can't figure out what's going on in the front of this one. And honestly, the next day I had the information. Amazing. So
Maria
thank you, Maria.
Maria not surprisingly.
Yeah. So our mixing crater, what's on the front of it? So on the sides by the handles, you can kind of just see there's like a floral motif. And this particular painter, always at the top of the floral motif, there would be a pistil and a stamen of the flower, and there'd be 3 little dots. So that was sort of the attribute that was his identifying mark. And then along the bottom, you can see there's sort of like a wave pattern. And then above it, we have a young man who is serving 2 people who are, I guess we'll call them banqueters, a man and a woman. So the man's in the center. Go forward one. There we go. The man's in the center, and then it's a woman on his right. And they're sitting on a cushion. And then can you kind of see there's some stripes in the middle there? They actually have some pillows that they're also sitting on. And then we can tell that she's a woman because if you can just barely make out on her head, she's got something wrapped around her head and tied in the back. And that is called a sacco. And it was really just kind of like a soft type of a cap that came around and then had the ties that kind of, stuck out in the back. So this one doesn't really have anything too controversial on it. Again, we have someone serving them something to drink. I believe it said that he is, he's got something on a plate in his hand. And then he's got, if you can see in his left hand, the person who's standing and serving, the very bottom of his left hand, the next thing we're going to see looks just exactly like the silhouette of that. So if we move on, please. So this is our Anakawee. Thank you, Kathleen, for the pronunciation. And this was a little tiny wine pitcher, and that's what he was holding in his hand. So she's been, as you can see, she was created anthropomorphically. So this picture takes on the visage of a woman, and her face is terracotta. Her eyebrows and eyes are incised. And then I thought it was interesting that they described her lips as trefoil lips. I'm like, trefoil, TRE, that means three. So I looked it up, and it means that her lips are shown in 3 lobes. So 1 lobe, 2 lobes, and 3 lobes. And we can see her hair kind of sticking out a little bit underneath her sacco hat. And then along the top of that hat, we were having a little bit of a discussion about that, there is actually a wreath of ivy leaves that surround her head. So even though this was a utilitarian vessel, it was important that it be beautiful for it to be successful. Kathleen, if we could move on. Now we come to the band cup, or also known as a kylix, and you can see it says group of Villa Giulia. Villa Giulia is actually a museum in Italy, and that's where this resides. So as I said, the naming conventions on these are all over the place. So our kylix is about 7 inches high, and this one's about 15 inches wide. So Ray, you actually said, was it meant for communal drinking?
Yeah, that's huge.
And it wasn't. I mean, but imagine this thing filled with whatever mixture of 1-to-1 water and wine. I think you'd be pretty well intoxicated by the time you finished off that cup of wine.
I think you could order wine by the glass in those times.
Yeah. And on the front of this, along that band, this is actually a scene of soldiers or infantrymen who are arming themselves. And right in the center, Kathleen, if you can find it, right above the stem, there's a man facing a woman. And the man has a scepter in his hand, and he is handing it to the woman. We know it's a woman because her face and her arm have been painted with white slip. And usually if you see the face and arm, face and the appendages of a person painted with white slip, it indicates that it's a woman. She's wearing something that's called a peplos, or it's like a kilt or a skirt. And again, we know that these are hoplites because we can see on, he's got one of those cuirass breastplates, and it's got a white dot on it, which is hard to see here, but we know that he is also of that group that was called hoplite. So what did I want to say? I wanted to say before we finish with these, that if you've noticed, most of the decoration on these is of humans. And in the Greek philosophy, human beings were the center of the universe. So we can see that the activities that they portrayed were either battle scenes or arming for battle or athletic contests, but it was always about the strength and beauty of humankind. Do we have any questions before we move on, Christine?
No, just a comment that this is a very beautiful piece.
It is beautiful. I don't know how those handles made it through. Sometimes in the research, you can see the pictures of these before our curatorial staff or a curatorial staff worked on them. And some of them do come in shards and have to be.
Absolutely. Yeah. They're found sometimes in burial mounds in 100 pieces. So. Right.
And they have to, it's a puzzle to put it all back together. But I know that the volute crater that we have at the DI was one of those. And, I think in one of our bulletins, they have pictures of it. It was in 1 million pieces, and they put it all back. It's one of the most beautiful Greek vessels that, we have on display.
Yeah, most of them came in broken.
Right.
Mhm.
Okay. From that, we'll move on. Oh, our beautiful tea and coffee service. So Kathleen, she tested me yesterday and I didn't have the right answer. So I'll make sure I have it today. So she wanted to know what all these pieces were. And I looked it up and now we know. So the one on the left is a coffee pot. The next one is a milk jug.
Okay.
And then we have a very small little 2.5-inch high coffee cup and saucer. And notice the saucer has depth to it because the practice was to pour your coffee into the saucer and drink it out of the saucer. In the center, we have the sugar bowl, another coffee cup, and then the last one on the right is actually the teapot. This was a breakfast set, and it's all of the pieces of this are quite small. That teapot's only 5 inches high. The coffee cups are only, a couple inches high. And all of it was meant to fit on the tray. And I think the tray, I'm not sure. I think the tray is only maybe about 17 inches wide. So, it's a very fragile, small, beautiful little breakfast set. And the color of it, you can see, is kind of a pale yellow ivory. This was created at the turn of the century from the 1700s to the 1800s. And at this time, the trend in porcelain ceramics were really bright colors. If you think of the Sèvres porcelain that we looked at in What's for Dinner 1, the service that was owned by Catherine the Great, it was that beautiful celestial blue, kind of an aqua color. And then if you think of the Meissen manufactories that were making porcelains at this time, everything had very colorful floral patterns on it. So this Viennese porcelain factory set was unusual because it's very, very pale in color, very different from what was being made at the time. So you can see it was made out of hard paste porcelain, which is probably why it survived, until today, because it was a very durable type of material. So if we can move to the next, please. So here's the beautiful little teapot. So let's talk a little bit about the shapes and what's on the paintings that are on these. So remember, we were just talking about how in the Greek philosophy, we really wanted to elevate humankind and we wanted to show, athletic prowess and contests and things like that. Well, now we've moved into, a time period where we're creating porcelain and we're creating dinnerware that has more than just a function of being something to eat or drink from. It's also more than just reinforcing the wealth of the people that own it, but now it's also become a historical document. So what do I mean by that? Well, on the front of this one, we see this little landscape, and this was an actual place. This was called the Peel Tower, and this existed in the gardens that were around Zarsko Selo, which was the summer palace in St. Petersburg. And it had beautiful landscape gardens all around it. So this little tower inside had a cascade of ice cold water that was used for cold baths. Mm. And then at the very top, where it kind of comes to a point, there was a drawing room where they could retire after they, had their cold bath, and then they could look out upon the gardens. So they were up maybe like a story and a half. So it was a really good vantage point. Okay,
That's
so we'll go to the next.
It is beautiful rendering.
If we go to the next. And then this is the inset that's on that large tray. And this was called, all of these little rivers were kind of artificially dammed and backed up to create what they called cascades. They, in the Russian vernacular of landscape design, these rushing waters were something that they desired. So they would back up and create these cascades. And if you can see under the bridge, the water's actually kind of coming over a little waterfall. So this bridge was originally built out of wood, painted to look like stone, but of course it deteriorated over time. So the second time it was rebuilt out of stone, and they named the bridge after the man who designed and built it, and it became the Visconti Bridge. and it goes over the Slavianka River. So you can see these fellows on horseback that are riding alongside. This isn't an army. These are, the ruling class out for, a little Sunday stroll on horseback, and they would call these events cavalcades. And this is what they did, as a pastime. And when they were done, either doing a cavalcade or maybe sitting in one of the beautiful little follies, or maybe going for their cold bath, then they would come back home, or they might sit under one of the pavilions, and that's when they would have hot tea or hot coffee. So if we can go to the next, please, Kathleen. Before I get into the family story, I want to talk, Kathleen, maybe if you could go back all the way to the first picture. I wanted to talk about the shapes of these items. So one more back, please. So if you look at the shapes of them, they're very round. They're not conical, like we see teapots and things today, and they kind of have a narrower top, and these are all in cylindrical shapes. And they were actually built that way so that they could take these landscape paintings. They were created so that they could be painted upon. And all of the paintings that you see on here came from a couple of watercolor atlases that had been commissioned by the Russian royal family. And then they were reinterpreted and painted onto these porcelain sets. I'm sure this wasn't the only one. There were probably many. So on that sugar bowl, we have the initials J and AP. And if Kathleen, you'll go to the last slide now, we will talk a little bit about the lovers and who this was created for. So the situation here was Grand Duchess Alexandra Pavlovna was Russian, and she was the granddaughter of Catherine the Great. So Catherine the Great had a son, Paul. Paul was her father. She was destined to marry the Archduke of Austria, and I think he was also called the Palatine of Hungary. She was only 16. He was 23. And when we were looking at these portraits before, we remarked upon how the portrait on the left is Archduke Joseph when he was very young, when he was only in his 20s. And yet he looks so much older than the portrait that's in the center, which was later on in his life when he was probably about 50. And if you look at her in her portrait, she can only be 16 because she died at 17. She can't be any older than 17. And because of this, practice of wearing these heavily powdered white wigs, they look so much older than in reality. So Alexandra Pavlovna, she and her sister were a year apart, and they were favorites of Catherine the Great. She arranged both of their marriages. And for poor Alexandra, who at 16 had to leave her homeland and go to Austria without any relatives, all alone in a strange place, it was a very difficult life. She became pregnant. She had the baby. Baby died within hours, and then she unfortunately died of an infection like 9 days later. And a week later, her father was assassinated. So it was a very tumultuous time in the Russian political scheme of things. Archduke Joseph Anton was married twice more, but he really did have quite a deep love and affection for her. So when we wonder why this was commissioned, there are three different ideas of why this might have been commissioned, and we're not really set on which one is actually true. So some say that Joseph and Alexandra ordered it shortly after they were married, and then the work was halted when she died. So it was started in 1799 and finished in 1804, so 5 years to create this. It was completed when he returned to Russia from Austria in 1803. So he went back to Russia after her death for a 3-month sojourn. So perhaps it was created, the commission was finished as a remembrance to her. The second idea is that it was intended as a diplomatic gift to Alexander I, who was her brother, so that he would have something to remember her by. And then the third idea was that it was intended as a remembrance to be presented to her mother, who was Maria Fedorovna. So we're not sure which of the three, but obviously it was meant to be a gift. And Kathleen, if you'll just quickly go back to the large painting. At the very bottom right corner, there's kind of, it looks like a square, almost like a bale of hay. It's actually a rock. And on that rock is an inscription. And the inscription says something to the effect that this was created and meant to be a gift. So we're not sure who the gift was meant to be given to, but we know that it was created to be a gift. Let's see, we're at pretty close to 2, right, Ray?
We're actually over about 5 minutes over today.
Okay, so Ray, why don't we skip to your last item because it's important to close with that?
Okay, sure.
All right.
So if you go back one, thank you. These ceramic bowls are for serving food. They are from over 5,000 years ago and are believed to be one of the world's first mass-produced products. Archaeologists have found bowls like these by the thousands. They are ration bowls and made to feed the thousands of workers building the world's first cities in Mesopotamia, which is now known as Iran. The process of making these bowls was simple and really may constitute the first production line. So they took a ball of clay and they pressed it in a mold, and it's probably a hole in the ground, and then the bowl was fired. What is fascinating, as you can see, that the impression of the potter's fist can be found at the bottom of the bowl. You can see it a little bit to the right, and Kathleen, oops, the other way. And go on one more slide. Up the other way. There we go. Yeah, you can see it a little bit better. And that's actually how it's displayed. That's a picture of it being displayed in the DIA's Ancient Middle East Gallery, which is on the first floor. With that, we should close.
All right, Ray. So the works of art that we presented today, they ranged from rare porcelain that we just looked at, metalwork, paintings, and ancient pottery. And they illustrate the impact of advances in manufacturing and technology. You know, we talked about gilding, we talked about metalsmithing, chasing, even this, you know, very primitive handheld piece of clay. And that they also lean toward the preservation of traditions and customs among some of these, you know, these social sets. So some of the pieces serve as historical documentation of places long lost, as we saw on the the Austrian breakfast set, or as commemorative objects that might be presented in commemoration of outstanding achievements, as we saw in the amphora. Overall, their purpose has been enhanced by the intrinsic beauty of their craftsmanship. So not only were they meant to be utilitarian, but to be successful, they needed to be beautiful. So going forward, the exhibitions that we have at the DIA that are open for you right now, we have the New Black Vanguard. You have to get down there this weekend because it closes on Sunday. Don't miss it. It's colorful, beautiful. You won't walk out of there without being uplifted. The 85th Annual Detroit Public Schools Student Exhibition starts on April 23rd and will go through May 29th. And the Shirley Woodson Shield of the Nile Reflections exhibition goes through June 12th. And we also have Van Gogh's Artistic Roots through January 29th of 2023. So as you know, the DIA's hours are listed on our website and registration is still required. Next Thursday, please join us on April 21st, where we will have an interview with Shirley Woodson, the artist who created the Shield of the Nile Reflections exhibition. A special thank you to Amanda Harrison, our Community Engagement Manager, Chris Mark, our Manager of Volunteer Development, Maria Ketchum, the Director of DIA Research, Library and Archives, amazing. And of course, Kathleen McBroom, who is a volunteer docent just like Ray and I, and so kindly works with us on the slide presentations, which, trust me, folks, takes a lot of time and it isn't easy. So thank you all for your contributions to today's presentation. And Ray, thanks for making this so much fun. You made me laugh out loud so many times.
You're a good sport.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you.